Okay.
All right, we are now officially recording. I want to again thank everyone for rejoining us today for the AASHTO Council on Public Transportation and MTAP 2020 virtual winter meeting. Welcome back. This is session number 7, and I just want to go through. I want to go through a couple of housekeeping items first. Let's start with first, send us a chat with your name, your title, your organization, and your state, if of course it's not obvious from the organization that you're sending us. That's in lieu of doing around the world with 41 people on the screen. So I think we're going to avoid that. So let's start with the virtual roll call. Please send me a chat. Let us know who's online with us right now. Also, please keep your mic closed, as well as possibly even your video, unless you want us to see your lovely face. But otherwise, I think we want to highlight the people who are presenting today. So if you're not speaking, please stay on mute. Also, last but not least, please use the chat function in addition to doing the roll call. Please feel free to use it to communicate with any of the panelists, communicate with any of your fellow attendees, and just use it because it's a great technology that allows communication while everything's happening around you. All right, and now, ladies and gentlemen, I'm going to turn it over to our moderator, Charles Carr, our research chair of the Council on Public Transportation and MTAP, and gentleman from Mississippi DOT. Charles, please take it away.
All right, thank you, Richard. Welcome to everyone. We're glad that you're able to join us today. We've got a packed schedule, and I think you're going to find the information that's being presented very, very informative. As Don said today, this is the day where we will pay a lot of attention to things that really are involving the ins and outs of how we manage these programs and give us a lot of perspective, I think. So today's session, update on the NCHRP, TCRP, and you can see that on the screen. I think it's important to keep in mind that because research is an area that at the urging and at the request, as well as the active involvement of our Transportation Council, as well as the MTAP group itself, these projects, whether they're funded through NCHRP, TCRP, or other resources, are very important to not only the DOTs, but to our transit provider community, as well as our consumers. Today, we're going to have 3 parts to this session. The first is going to be an update on NCHRP 2065 research projects that will be presented by Dr. Velvet Fitzpatrick, Senior Program Officer within TRB's Cooperative Research Program. That'll be followed by a presentation and discussion of the final report for one of our most recent completed projects, NCHRP 2065 project, Task 75. That's baseline research on available, in-kind, and local match sources. That'll be led by, Victor Zong from AECOM and his team. And they will also present for us, or to us, a accompanying guide, research guide on use of in-kind as match for FTA awards. And then finally, what we will have will be, as an added bonus, Scott Belcher. He's with the Mineta Transportation Institute. He's a leading researcher on cybersecurity preparedness. And what we'll be looking at is transit industry's readiness for cyber attacks. So without going through very much additional detail, we're going to start with Dr. Fitzpatrick. She'll make her presentation, and we'll go to Victor and his team and follow up with Scott.
Thank you. Thank you, Charles, and thank you, Richard, for clicking through this slide. So we'll stay on the opening slide here for a moment while I give some general updates about TRB and the Transit Cooperative Research Program. So those of you who are already registered or are still planning to register for the TRB annual meeting, I would say go to the TRB website, trb.org, and click on the annual meeting hot link. And you should note that there is now a new video that describes to you and provides an example of what you can expect at the virtual meeting, our first ever virtual meeting. which is also our centennial celebration. So it's kind of fitting that we're changing our way of presenting, even though we're in a pandemic. And the focus is the next 100 years. If you were at the beginning of our centennial celebration, at the beginning of this year in January, the focus was looking back at the previous 99 years and what we had accomplished and what the transportation industry wants to do. So definitely go to the website and look at that new video so you can get a feel for the virtual meeting and how we're going to do that throughout the entire month of January. Next, I wanted to give a brief update on the Transit Cooperative Research Program. You can still stay on the first slide, Richard, if you want, or you can rest here. And I want to let you all know that we did select new projects in October with the TOPS governing committee for the Transit Cooperative Research Program. And the newly announced research projects are available on the TCRP website for you to nominate yourself, because we are seeking panel members. And those panel nominations are due February 5th, 2021. Again, that's Friday, February 5th, and you can see that at trb.org/TCRP. Just to briefly describe the titles of some of the projects that you can expect. We have one about Transportation Emergency Response Application, TERA, Insulated Joint Failure Investigation, Planning for Innovation and Emerging Mobility Futures in Intermodal Passenger Facilities, Mental Health, Wellness, and Resilience for Transit System Workers, Racial Equity, Black in America, and Public Transportation, addressing disproportionate shares of health, economic, and transportation impacts for lower income households and communities of color. And we have 3 other projects listed as well, dealing with paratransit needs and those of the like. So if any of those titles sounded of interest to you and you wanted to nominate yourself, please go to trb.org/TCRP and nominate yourself to be a member and to serve on one of those panels. All right, so wrapping up, you can go ahead and go to the next slide, Richard. It's just a status update of NCHRP 2065, which is still sunsetting the final projects addressing public transportation needs. And so we wanted to share the good news in that 3 of those projects were completed and are available on the web. And you're going to hear from one of the research teams in the PIs today, Victor Zong, for Task 75. So on this presentation, which will be available on the website, you will be able to click through and access the final report and the guidebook for Task 75, which is the baseline research on allowable in-kind and local match sources you'll hear from today. You'll also be able to get the report and use the presentation created by the contractor for the opportunities for state DOTs and others to encourage shared use mobility practices in rural areas. And lastly, you'll also be able to access the report for lessons learned and impacts to date of state DOT implementations of new federal transit asset management and public transportation. So those are all available. And if you go to the next slide, Richard, we have 5 that are still active. So of course, like many of the projects active with in TRB, there have been some changes to the schedules to make room for the changes to the public transportation community overall in the US as far as access to complete studies and getting feedback from surveys and things of that nature. So these are the 4 of the 5 projects that are still active. The last one is on the next slide because it cannot fit, but you can still anticipate that these projects will be available and completed next year once things settles and get a little back to normal for everyone in the working space. And again, you can access those on the project website by typing in NCHRP 2065 into Google. It'll pop right up. So that's the only update I have, and I would like to hand it back to Charles or hand it directly over to Victor to follow up.
I think we can proceed on with Victor, unless there is a question that someone has about one of these projects. We're not prepared to go into the weeds, but if there's anything that you'd like to get high level. I strongly encourage with what Velvet was commenting about the panel. I strongly encourage folks to get involved, our membership, our council, MTAP group, to get involved in the panel process. It can be as much a learning experience as it can be a beneficial experience for sharing the knowledge that you have. So I think we'll move on now to Victor. And what we'd like to do is have Victor and his team. I think we indicated that one of the, Diane is not going to be able to join us, right, Victor?
Yeah, correct. It will be me and Dan.
Dan Wagner, okay. Well, let's welcome Victor. He reminded me when I asked him a little bit of information that he's been out here providing management solutions for public transit industries all across North America and in a lot of areas, funding and federal compliance, excuse me, analysis, regional governance, organizational management, procurement. So a wealth of experience, but what we want to get today is a real good look at, a summary look at the baseline research report that was done. It was initiated because we were anticipating pre-pandemic that we were going to be faced with crisis on local match. One of those local match issues that a number of us were struggling with was the appropriate use of in-kind as an opportunity because local match was drying up. And I think this is extremely appropriate now because even though we are facing a situation where we do have the 100% money at this point, that will not forestall the need to go back into getting additional local match and how we can best utilize that going into the future. So Victor, I'm turning it over to you.
Great. Well, thank you very much, Charles. Thank you for the introduction and setting a stage for this presentation. As Charles said, this research was initiated to address the challenge at the local level to come up with matching funds to FTA awards. And I would say our research was conducted particularly for that purpose. And also we have a strong focus on in-kind, which is also the focus of our presentation today. But we do, for this research, looked at some other sources of matching funds as well, in particular, non-US DOT federal funds that could be used as a match to FTA awards. So we'll get into some more details on our findings. Richard, can you switch the next slide, please? Thank you. So here's a brief agenda for our presentation today. We'll start with a brief introduction and a research approach. So what the research team has done to come up with these fundings and develop the guidebook for in-kind match. And then we'll have a very brief overview of the findings on the various sources that could be used as matching funds to FTA awards. And then the third part would be a detailed look at the guidebook for in-kind match, which is an important part of our presentation today, and Dan will be leading that section. And then we'll have some time for questions and answers. And the last part of the presentation is some additional details on the survey responses and findings, which I think we probably won't go through slide by slide, but it would be a good reference for anyone who's interested, or maybe could be a reference for the Q&A session if we need to look at some data there. And with that, we can start with section 1, introduction and research approach. So as Charles gave us the introduction goes, the research objective obviously is trying to provide some guidance for both state DOTs as well as the subrecipients on how to come up with funding to be used as match to FTA awards. And we hope the research can provide some inspirations on sources of local match that aren't regularly used in the past and could be a good potential going forward that help our recipients and subrecipients maximize their use of FTA funding. And our focus has been, for this research, has been looking at some more traditional funding sources as well as more innovative sources. But again, in-kind match is definitely the focus. And we also did some work on non-US DOT federal funds, which, by the way, the CCAM, the Coordinating Council on Access and Mobility, which is a consortia of federal agencies, they have recently published a guidebook on federal fund braiding, which is using federal funds as a match for other federal programs. So we'll briefly mention that as well. And then obviously the guidebook again would be our focus and the highlight of this research project. So next slide, please. This is our research team. We are a great team of people from both AECOM and Milligan. From AECOM side, we have myself and Scott Baker, and from Milligan side, we have Dan Wagner, who's with us today. And we also have Diane King and Saida Durante, who helped with the research and developing the guidebook. Next slide. So it's, I would say, pretty common and standard research methodology. We started with a literature review and we did a survey of state DOTs. We've got 24 very good informative responses, which helped us compile the final report as well as help us develop the in-kind match guidebook through identifying, for example, good case studies and good best practices. And I would also add to that, we did a very thorough outreach to FTA, both to FTA's regional offices. We interviewed all 10 of them. And we also met with the CCAM, the Coordinating Council on Access and Mobility. We exchanged our progress on research regarding how or what federal programs can be used as a match for FTA grants. And that has been a very good cooperation as well. And at the end, when we developed the guidebook for in-kind match, we also obtained FDA headquarters review. They provided the right comments on the guidebook. But I think Dan would want to emphasize that this is not a FDA document. This is our research product. So at the end, FDA would have to approve whatever in-kind match that is going to be submitted. And then we also did case studies with 5 rural and small urban transit operators. Through them, we were able to get a very in-depth understanding of how certain kinds of resources have been used as in-kind match. And there are a lot of best practices from these case studies that Dan would have some time to go through the highlights from these case studies. So that was our approach. And next slide, I think we can, I would just emphasize that for this research project, we have 2 separate deliverables. One is the final research report where we documented the whole research process and our findings. And we have a separate document, which is the guidebook. The idea is that we want to have a separate guidebook so that it could be an easy to use tool people can pick up and use as a reference on a day-to-day basis. So the guidebook is designed to be easy to access document that for any of us on the call and for our sub-recipients as well. Hopefully you'll find it helpful. And I know Velvet will probably want me to emphasize this. Both of these documents can be found on TRB's website, and the link here will direct you to the web page with both documents available. So, and next slide, please. So yeah, so we can have a high-level overview of the sources of match that we found through the research. And the sources were mainly found through our survey of state DOTs, as well as the interviews we conducted with all 10 FDA regional offices. And all those interviews and survey helped us identify these sources that have been actually used successfully by one or more recipients or sub-recipients. So we know these can be done and have been done successfully by our peers. And then we also identified the different types of in-kind match. We will get into that in a little bit. And again, the federal fund braiding is another thing we did a little bit. And the research we did in that regard is mostly from a transit funding recipient's perspective. So we look at it from the perspective of what other federal programs that can be used as a match to FDA awards. In other words, the funding from the other federal programs would be the match fund to the FDA award. And obviously CCAM's focus is much broader and comprehensive. They'll be looking at from both sides. It could involve FTA's funds being used as a match to some other federal programs. So I would encourage everyone to look at CCAM's publication as well. It's a very comprehensive, very useful guidance. So next slide, please. So as many of you probably know, TRB has done several previous research on sources of local matching funds. And we sort of replicate those research. We took the sources that have been identified before, and we did it in our in our survey with state DOTs to see which of those funding identified before have been actually successfully used in FDA grant applications. So the final report has a very comprehensive summary of these sources that have been identified in our survey. But mainly, the bullets listed on this slide are the different types of local funding matches. So I think we all are familiar with the non-fare box operating revenue, for example, advertising and contract revenue. And then we have fees, vehicle registration fees, and taxes is another big area, general revenue, property tax and sales tax, bond and loan proceeds. So you have different loans and bonds that states typically have. And then private contribution, we've heard donations and corporate sponsorship. And then federal fund braiding is a relatively newer area, I would say, in terms of TRB's research. And then in-kind match, which is the focus for our study. Next slide, please. So we'll get into more details about in-kind match here. In our survey, we try to understand what are the types of resources that have been used as in-kind match. And you can see in this table, we also listed the number of states which reported the use of these resources as in-kind. And remember, these numbers are out of the 24 that responded. So as you can see, intercity bus service is the largest group. I mean, the largest, the type with most states reporting that they have used it. Out of 24, there are 15 states reported this use. And staff time is another major area of in-kind match. I should say staff and volunteer time. So this would include volunteer drivers or people who attend meetings for planning purposes, for example. And all of these time can be recorded and used as in-kind match. And land facilities is another area of a lot of use of in-kind. You can take donation of land for a particular capital project as in-kind match, for example. So all of those, I know Dan will provide a much deeper, much detailed introduction later on in this presentation, so I wouldn't go into a lot of depth here. But I would just point to the final report of this research, or at the end of this slide deck, you will see a good summary of these statistics about which state and how many states have used these in-kind match resources. We also have a set of maps that shows the geographical distribution of where these in-kind match resources have been used in the past. So I think that would be a good reference for everybody where it has been use. And I guess there could be conversations that happen and we all can share our experience with each other. So next slide, please. Right, so obviously the federal FTA has their own regulations and rules in terms of how you can use in-kind match. But we also found that many states also have their own rules when it comes to using in-kind. And one common theme that we heard from the state survey is that administrative burden has been a major obstacle for subrecipients to use in-kind, especially for the smallest system. They just don't have the capacity a lot of times to understand the process and to actually comply with all the administrative requirements, keeping records and compiling the evidence to support the hourly rate, for example, for volunteers or staff time. So those are things that we, through this research, hope to help everybody achieve or make it easier at least. So partly due to the administrative burden, but there are also some other considerations. Some states actually do not allow in-kind match. And we heard from Pennsylvania mentioned that they didn't allow it because the state provides sufficient matching funds for their subrecipients. So there isn't a very prominent needs for the use of in-kind in their state. And California also mentioned that in their state, the total revenue is able to cover a lot of the local match requirements. And then some other states, they also have their own requirements or rules in terms of how in-kind match can be used. These are very specific requirements depending on their needs or characteristics. So I'll just quickly go through them. West Virginia only allows intercity bus in-kind, and New Mexico does not allow in-kind match for 5310, but they will approve in-kind match for 5311 on a case-by-case basis. Oregon has a 50% maximum in-kind match requirement, so you have to come up with at least 50% of the local match from some other sources. And Montana, they limit their in-kind match to 15% of the total grant amount. And New Hampshire, they have a cap on the hourly rate that you claim for volunteer drivers or meeting participants. So with that, we can go to the next slide. Right, so this is just a reminder about CCAM's publication on federal fund braiding. This is the link to CCAM's website for that publication. So with that, I'm gonna hand over to my colleague, Dan Wagner, who is our wizard of in-kind match, and he will talk about how you can make the magic happen.
Great, thank you, Victor. For some reason, my camera isn't working. It probably has very good taste. So I don't know why it's not, but anyway, it's a pleasure to be here. I'm Dan Wagner with Milligan, and we were fortunate enough to work with Victor and Scott on this study, and it was an exciting study for us. It we were able to put a lot of thoughts down from our years of experience in a helpful, what we think is a helpful guidebook. So next slide, please. So again, as Victor said earlier, this is FTA was heavily involved in this study, but the guidebook is not official FTA guidance. FTA has the final say on the eligibility of in-kind. So when you, FTA likes to see the in-kind listed in award applications. So that's the time to get FTA's approval, and hopefully reference to the guide might help you in that effort. Next slide, please. Okay, so what is in-kind? So it's goods or services that you receive without incurring any expense that can be used as match. It's usually provided by a third party, but not always. And some common examples are volunteer labor And then, of course, the intercity bus, which is in statute. Next slide, please. So how does it work? So we have on the left-hand column, you have, it's just cash match only. So this is the operating assistance. You have $50,000 in operating assistance. You'll get that with $50,000 in local match, and you'll have $100,000 in cash to spend. However, in the right-hand column, if you can come up with some in-kind, and in this example, $10,000, that gets you an additional $10,000 in FTA operating assistance. So your net operating expenses is $110,000 with $10,000 in in-kind. And it's 1-for-1 for 50-50 for operating, but a $1 in-kind gets you $4 of in-kind for capital. So that is something to consider if you can use in-kind for capital. Next slide, please. Here's just a graphic example of the same thing, is that again, if you have for operating assistance, $10,000 in kind will get you an additional $10,000 in FTA operating assistance. Next slide, please. So the federal requirements, so the Uniform Guidance 2 CFR 200, all the cost principles in the Uniform Guide govern in kind. So in the guidebook, we highlight two parts of the Uniform Guide. One is the 306, which is cost sharing or matching. So what are the requirements there? The in-kind needs to be verifiable from records. You can't use it to match any other federal award. You can't double dip. The costs need to be necessary and reasonable to undertake the project. It has to be allowable under subpart E, the cost principles. You can't use a federal, as in-kind, federal funds from another source. Oh, sorry about that. That's nothing. You can't use it from another federal source as in-kind unless that's allowed by that program. And Victor mentioned, I think there's a link to it in the slides about the braiding study, braiding of funds that has come out. The in-kind needs to be in the approved budget, and the in-kind needs to conform to all the provisions of the Uniform Guidance. Next slide, please. Another key thing to think about when considering the allowability of in-kind is, we quote here, the Uniform Guide again, necessary and reasonable. It has conformed to any limitations or exclusions of the award program. It must be consistent with how other activities are treated. What that kind of means is if it's an indirect cost for everybody else, you need to treat it as an indirect cost. If it's a direct cost for everybody else, you can treat it as a direct cost. So you have to treat the cost the same as you would with other activities. And that's kind of the next bullet. Those two are related. Again, it can't be used to match other federally financed programs. You can't double dip there, and it has to be adequately documented. So those two paragraphs from the 2 CFR, they kind of say the same thing, but they're key to understanding whether or not in-kind is allowable. Next slide, please. Okay, what are the FTA requirements? Okay, FTA requires use of non-DOT sources, except for Federal Lands Highway Program funds, as match. So the FHWA Tribal Transportation Program, since that is a part of the Federal Lands Highway Program, that can be used as match. That's different from the FTA's Tribal Transit Program. That cannot be used as match. And then also in the statute, there's two types of in-kind. This was something relatively new. Van pool credits, and we have a sample of that, a case study on that. That's relatively new, and people would recommend, if you're operating a van pool program or you're considering operating one, to look at that case study. Then of course, intercity bus, which has been around for a while. Next slide, please. Some other in-kind basics. Okay, so it has been eligible costs. We have several slides on that. It has been eligible source of match. So it's both sides of the ledger, cost and match, and needs to be eligible. And you need to account for it as an expense and a revenue. I did some work where the program people, they used land as in-kind for facility renovation and expansion. And the accountants weren't comfortable with it. And after some discussion, we realized that they neglected to include the in-kind as a revenue. They were just including it as an expense. So it's an expense and a revenue. As the uniform guidance says, it must be fully documented, and you can document it within and or outside the accounting system. I've just worked with a small urban system, and we've set it up to track the in-kind within the accounting system, which makes it kind of easier than having separate spreadsheets or something outside the accounting system. Next slide, please. So some of the examples in our case studies, we have, we talk about labor, rental space, land and buildings, equipment, goods and services, indirect costs, intercity bus, van pool credits, and travel expenses. Now, I'm not going to go through all these in detail. They're in the guidebook, but this is what there's a section on each of these topics in the book. Next slide, please. So some useful tips here is that even for volunteers, fringe benefits are an eligible in kind. And that's the reference from the uniform guidance. So if you're using volunteer drivers, you can apply your fringe benefit rate to the rate that you're charging the volunteers to the program. There's aggregate rate of pay versus actual rate of pay. FTA prefers the discussion on in-kind labor is some people like, especially let's say NPOs will use attendance at meetings for in-kind. FTA wants you to use actual pay rates instead of just an aggregate pay rate for attendees if it's feasible. And if it's not feasible, the guidebook gives you some sources to look for estimated or aggregate pay rates. The next bullet is can be summarized by saying you can't pay rent to yourself. And this is a common mistake in use of in-kind. Rental costs must be under a less than arm's length relationship. So we in our work doing oversight, we've come across where, let's say, a county will charge in-kind for in rent to the grant for the transit operations. That is not allowed. Again, it must be less than arm's length. You can charge actual costs, things like prorated depreciation, any repairs or maintenance, prorated utilities. But again, if you're charging any of those things, you have to make sure that you treat them like you treat those costs for everybody else. If they're in the indirect cost pool, you'd have to charge them as an indirect cost. If they're not in the indirect cost pool, you can charge them as a direct cost. If somebody is leasing you a space in kind, letting you use their space, that lease needs to be in writing. And then if for any amount of your getting for any real property that you're using as an in-kind contribution, FTA requires an appraisal and then a review appraisal for that in-kind. Okay, next slide, please. Any questions for Victor or for me at this point?
We actually had a question from Dave Harris. What is a typical example of an in-kind match source for capital besides land for a facility?
Well, if you're using if you get doing preventive maintenance at 80/20, you can use in-kind labor or parts for that. So that's an example. For other capital, I really, besides real property, I really haven't seen anything for that. Thanks, Dave, for putting me on the spot, by the way. So yeah, I haven't, I can't come up with anyone off the top of my head, and nothing really came up. We do have an example of people using use of equipment to build a facility. And I think that was eligible as a capital expense. So that is in the guide, so that we do have another example than just real property. So, great.
Yeah, I think Dan gave a good answer there, and I would just add to it, from our survey, we did hear some pretty unique resources. So one state used steel, apparently donation from somewhere, we didn't get into the detail, and gravel as well for some construction projects. But yeah, land and facility is definitely the most common in-kind match for capital projects.
Are there other questions?
Those are all the questions I have from the chat. If someone wants to open their mic, now's a good time. Feel free to ask a question of any of the speakers.
Just as an observation, I want to make sure that we are clear again on the prohibition against using the whole double dipping concept, because that's in these slides several times. But again, that language that I think I remembered seeing, the determining factor is whether it is specifically approved by some statute from another federal program, right? If a federal program other than DOT does approve it as a part of that
Yes.
statute or regulations, it can be used to match, right?
Yeah, it'll have to, yes, that program, the matching program has to be authorized by statute to be used as a matching fund. So really both sides. So FDA already have that authority, already give that authority. So the other matching program has also to be specifically allowed to be used as matching fund.
Yeah.
Yeah, go ahead, Charles.
No, go right ahead. Go right ahead.
Oh, I was going to say the CCAM guidance has a very nicely formatted table where it shows whether a particular federal program is allowed to be used as a matching fund for other federal programs. And it's a long table with, I don't know, maybe 60, 70 programs, different federal programs. So a very nice guide.
And I'm sorry, Charles.
I'm just saying that sounds very promising. Go ahead.
The other thing too is that in that grading study, some of FTA programs can be used as match for other programs. So if you're potentially interested in doing that, the grading study will let you know which FTA programs can be used as match for other programs.
Or I see Danielle from CCAM is on this call as well. I don't know if she wants to add something to that question, because she was leading this federal fund grading study. Hi, Danielle.
Hi, I'll just mention in the table you're talking about, there are 64 programs. We only got through 64 of the 130. And it was just because it was so time intensive to sit down with their general counsel and ours. And
Sure.
One thing I wanted to clarify is we at FTA have specific guidance from Congress saying we can take other federal funds that are non-DOT as incoming match. So if the other statute is silent, you only need authority on our side if the other is silent. But some have prohibitions in theirs. like Older Americans Act funds specifically say they cannot take other funds, silent or not, as their incoming. So that's what that guide we did is we sat down and looked at both statutes. If one was silent, that's okay. So that 64 programs on that spreadsheet that you mentioned is very helpful because we went through those and looked. Unfortunately, it's if there are reauthorizations and changes, we're not going to be updating it at this time, but it's up to date as when we published it, which was this past summer.
I think that's a very
Victor, we have
good
a question.
Oh, go ahead.
Charles, give me a sec. We have a question from Shelley Winters in New Hampshire. Shelley, please go ahead.
Thanks. Dan, longtime fan of yours. Question, if a contractor or consultant gives a reduced rate for a product or service, they're going to reduce it sort of pro bono as a community benefit. Are the incremental savings available as an in-kind match? And if so, what kind of documentation would be necessary from them?
Hey, Shelley, how are you? We did not address that. That's an interesting point. What I would do is document what the regular rate is, and then show the billing rate, and then in the application, the FTA show that, and then hopefully FTA will approve that. But interesting, that did not come up in our surveys with the states, and it didn't come up, that example did not come up in our interviews with the 10 regional offices either. So thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, Richard, how are we doing on time?
Or Victor, how are you doing on slides?
This is our Q&A session, and we have some additional details about the survey results that we can show, but I want to make sure that
let's go through those quickly.
Questions. Okay, yeah, very quickly. Additional information. So this is a compilation of the survey results, and we are showing how many states have used each of these funding sources of funding. Advertising apparently is the most common. Non-fare box operating revenue, and contra revenue is also very common. And the next section on fees, we've got a few responses that identified that they have used vehicle fees and parking fees and driver's license, etc. And then going on to the next slide, we've got taxes. You see there are more responses of using taxes. General revenue is the most common one. Sales tax and property tax are very common as well. And we've also got some other, I guess, less common taxes that have been used. For example, room and occupancy taxes. I guess that's mostly from hotels. Special assessment districts, transportation improvement districts. These are more, I guess, more innovative and progressive tax sources. So yeah, that's for the taxes. And going on to the next slide, we've got bond and loan proceeds. We don't have a lot of responses in this area. We've got two states reporting they use general obligation bonds, 2 states reporting they have loans from the state infrastructure banks. Private contribution, we've got more responses in terms of donations, and we have corporate sponsorship, employer contributions, and PPP, joint development funding as well, to help with transit projects. And going on to the next slide. So here, federal program funds and in-kind, we just group them together here. We showed a slide earlier in the presentation for the different kinds of in-kind match resources. And here we've got 17 out of 24 states reported their subrecipients use in-kind match. And 15 out of 24 states reported their subrecipients use other federal funding as match to FDA awards. We've also got volunteer efforts. 11 out of 24 states reported that, and 6 out of 24 reported use of toll credits or transportation development credits. And there are some fill in the blank sources where we got from the survey. These are, I think some of them, for example, university fee may have been reported differently from other states. They might be included in employer or user fees in the earlier section. But some other may be more unique. For example, the lottery profit from the state lottery. Actually, this might be also included in some other responses in the early section as well. But this table gives you an idea of these different sources, sort of like an update to our earlier TRB studies on sources of local funds. And then we also look at how the geographic distribution of the in-kind match specifically, different types of resources used as in-kind. So Richard, you can go to the next slide, please. Yep. So this is a map showing the use of land as in-kind match. The green states are the ones who reported their subrecipients have used land as in-kind match in their state. I would also just say that the purple, or I don't know what this color is, this dark purplish color shows the 4 states that don't allow in-kind match at this point. And then the white states are ones that we didn't hear from. And then the gray states are ones that do not use, their subrecipients don't use land as in-kind match at this point. So that's for land. And then we also mapped out the use of facilities, which are the light pink states. There are a few more states that use facilities as in-kind match, right? And we also map out staff time. Again, the pinkish color states are the ones who reported staff time. Probably a few more states use staff time as well. The next slide, please, which is the volunteer time used as in-kind match. So you see there a little bit of geographic variation between the different kinds of in-kind match. Seems like in the Midwest, states in the Midwest tend to use in-kind more, and maybe in the Pacific Northwest states and Northern Mountain states also use in-kind more often. Next slide, please. Use of vehicle as in-kind. This is interesting. There's only one state reported using vehicle as in-kind, Iowa. So this is a unique one. And going on, intercity buses. This is another pretty common one. Again, the Midwest states, a lot of them use intercity bus service as in-kind. And also in the Western states, quite a few of them use this as in-kind as well. And also in New England, 3 states in New England use it as well. All right. So and then we also compiled a table of different federal funding programs that have been used as match to FDA awards, and these are successful examples of using other federal funds as match. So we listed out all the program names here, as well as the federal agency that administer these programs and how many states have used them. Obviously, Medicaid is the most common one. And there are some less common one that's only been used by 1 state, but it could be potentially replicated by other states as a potential new source of funding as match to FDA grants. So this would be, I think, a good reference of what our peers have used successfully in the past. I would say, the federal funding programs, they are evolving constantly. So maybe some of these programs no longer existed or have been merged with other programs. So there might be some changes to the names or even rules in terms of whether you can use them in the future or not, but I guess it could still be a good starting point to understand what other programs have been used successfully. But again, the CCAM guidance would be a very good and more recent, I would say, because the CCAM report was published in June this year, which is a few months after we've concluded this survey. So that's a little more recent. So that was the end of the slides. I want to just open up and see if there are more questions about any part of the presentation or our research.
I have no questions online. None in the chat. Are there any folks who wish to unmute themselves and ask a question? Well, Victor and Dan. Otherwise, Charles, I think we should move on to our next presentation. Shelley.
I agree. Thank you.
Shelley, you're good?
I just had a quick question, whether there was any suggested best practices for documentation of the different kinds of in-kind match that other states have used.
Oh gosh.
And do you want to give a few sentences on that?
The big challenge is with in-kind labor, because that's the most common, people need to do timesheets, and you can't get away from that. So I think if you are allowing your subrecipients to use in-kind labor, those folks need to complete timesheets and then have those on file.
Yeah, and I would just add to that it might be a good idea to take attendance, make that a habit in meetings with people from other agencies that you could claim as in-kind, and the attendance sheets could help with the documentation as well.
Thank you.
All right, Charles, should we move on?
All right, I think we can
Thank you.
move on to Scott. I think Scott's still with us, right?
Yes, sir.
Okay. Next, we'll have Scott Belcher, Principal Investigator, Moneta Transportation Institute. And Scott's also the President and CEO of SFB Consulting, where he specializes in transportation technology, the Internet of Things, smart cities, and the environment. He's going to share with us today. I've heard a number of people comment about this topic and seen some versions of a presentation before, maybe not the same one, but research on cybersecurity preparedness in the transit industry. So we're turning it over to you, Scott.
Thanks, Charles. Good afternoon. Can I get to the next slide, please? So for those of you, this is a presentation that will focus around cybersecurity, which is clearly in the news these days with the SolarWinds breach on the federal government just the last 2 days, and then the big Vancouver breach in the last 2 weeks. Everything around cybersecurity right now is based off of the NIST framework, which establishes the basis upon which all of the cybersecurity work that is being done is being based off of. And I think just to kind of set the framework for the discussion, we tend to think of cybersecurity either as OT or IT, and this is going to really focus around the IT side. And so that what that means is this is the piece of cybersecurity that goes to the organizational component. Often people tend to think of cybersecurity as an issue that the IT folks can deal with, that the computer folks can deal with. And that's just simply not true. This is an organizational issue. This is a cultural issue. This starts at the top. It starts with the CEO and the board, and it goes all the way down to the receptionist. And if you don't think of it in that way, then you're setting yourself up for very serious serious issues. And it's not about preparing yourself or protecting yourself from an attack. It's really being ready for the inevitable attack and how you respond and recover. So next slide, please. So the good news is that there is plenty of guidance out there for transit agencies. The NIST cybersecurity framework, which I mentioned. There is guidance specific to the transit agency. The transit agency, transit and the transit industry is one of the transit security sectors. And it's so as a result, it's given particular attention by the Department of Homeland Security, and the Department of Homeland Security and the US DOT are TSS, Transportation Security Sector leads for transit, and the large transit agencies have what's called a cybersecurity advisors program, where they actually get specific guidance and specific support from the Department of Homeland Security that comes with funding. The problem with that is that the vast majority of transit organizations don't qualify and don't get that kind of funding. But there is a considerable amount of resources at the state level through AASHTO, through the state departments of transportation, and then clearly at the industry association level. AASHTO and APTA do a wonderful job of supporting the transit organizations and providing documentation and providing guidance. Now the bad news, next slide please. And the bad news is that while there's plenty of guidance, resources, as you know, is really the limiting factor for transit organizations. And most agencies simply don't have a sense of their exposure or their risk. They really don't understand how exposed they are and how unprepared they are for cybersecurity, and what an issue it is. I think it's starting to become an issue. It's starting to become, that awareness is starting to creep in. But again, for most transit organizations, which are resource constrained to begin with, it is yet another unfunded mandate that has to be matched against other competing priorities. And as a result, transit agencies face the same challenges they face with other competing priorities. A lack of attention by senior executives, a lack of necessary training, a lack of necessary skill sets, a lack of necessary employees. So when we did our study, next slide please, our ultimate conclusion was not a good one. And the ultimate conclusion is that the industry is ill-prepared for the cyber attacks that we are seeing on a reoccurring basis. And we're seeing them on a regular basis now, like a drumbeat. And they're not just the big ones. They're not just the big ones that we read about in Vancouver or in Philadelphia or in San Francisco, but they're happening all across the country. Next slide, please. So what's interesting, we put together, can you go back one slide, please? I think I might have missed a slide here. Nope, okay. So let me just tell you a little bit about the presentation. I guess I shortened this presentation because I didn't have very much time. But what we did, just so you have a sense of what we did, is we worked with APTA. We surveyed over 1/3 of the public transit agencies in the United States. So we had, and that represented more than 1/3 of the United States population. So we had a very robust very robust survey population. it was representative of large and small agencies. We interviewed more than 40 individuals in more than hour-long interviews we interviewed transit heads, CISOs, people from the White House, people from FTA, DHS, Capitol Hill, consultants, experts throughout the industry, and from other industries. So we had, and then we did obviously a pretty robust literature search. And at the end, we made policy recommendations at every level. So what was really interesting is, so I gave you our kind of our bottom line, which was kind of gloomy, and then you see this this slide, which says that of our respondents, only 22% said that they thought that they had that they had suffered an incident. That really struck us as odd. That seemed very inconsistent with what we had heard from other industries, what we had seen in other surveys, what we had read in our research. And in fact, we presented an example from a very reputable Dell study of cloud companies, and 82% of those cloud companies had suffered what they considered a disruptive event, cybersecurity event. Next slide, please. So then, then it's even a little more confusing, because 81% said that they believed that they had the resources necessary, or that they believed that they were prepared, not the resources, they believed they were prepared to respond and that they had the information. Then things got a little dicey. Then things started to really get confusing and to become clearer. So first of all, only 60% of our respondents had cybersecurity plans. So I'm not quite sure how you can feel prepared to respond to a cybersecurity event, how you can even know you have a cybersecurity breach if you don't even have a plan. More than 40% of our respondents didn't feel they had the resources to respond if they were breached. And then almost 50% of our respondents don't audit their cybersecurity program on an annualized basis. So that seemed fairly inconsistent with the initial responses that we had. Next slide, please. One of the things that was also really disconcerting, and this is disconcerting not only from a cybersecurity standpoint, but from an SMS standpoint, was the lack of just basic security policies that these agencies had in place. If you look at this slide, you'll see that most of the agencies that we talked to did not have basic standards or policies and procedures in place. The most disconcerting one is that 51% of the agencies do not retain data logs for more than a year. Now that is very significant. If you don't maintain data logs, then you can't rebuild you can't respond to a breach. Once you find out that you've been breached, it's through the data logs that you find out when you've been breached, and then you can determine how to move forward. And if you're not maintaining the logs, you can't go back a day, an hour, a day, a week, a month. And if you can't do that, then you don't know how vulnerable and how exposed you are. That's critical. Having data logs are absolutely critical. Having a log maintenance schedule is one of the most important things that you can do. Having these basic disaster recovery, continuity and operation plans, business continuity plans, these are not just cybersecurity plans, but these are basic safety management system plans that, that these organizations should have in place. And not only should they have them in place, but they should be doing tabletop exercises and they should be auditing them on an annualized basis. Next slide, please. We also saw that many of the agencies did not have basic training. And training is not just training the technology staff, but it's training the entire staff. Your exposure on cybersecurity is not necessarily on the technology side. It's really throughout the entire organization. Where you're likely, you know, with respect to Vancouver, which we're still trying to unpack right now, where they're being held hostage by a ransomware attack in the tens of millions of dollars, was the result of a fishing expedition. That fishing expedition was likely to have come through a receptionist. I mean, heck, we're all working from home right now. You're taking your computers home. You're opening your laptop at your kitchen table. Your kids are maybe accessing your computer. You may be accessing your computer at a coffee shop. Where we have all kinds of new vulnerabilities that we're opening up, avenues of vulnerability. And then if you think about the way that we're now becoming mobility hubs, we don't think of ourselves any longer as simply as transportation providers. We think of ourselves as mobility hubs as we partner with scooter companies and bike share companies and ride share companies. Those organizations are partnering, that we're partnering with, we're sharing data with, we're opening our network, we're opening our networks to. That exposes us. And the interesting thing about that is we didn't do the kind of intensive survey and analysis of those companies that we did of the transit organization, but I know a lot about those companies. I spent a lot of time working with them. And I think it's safe to say that, that they don't think as much about cybersecurity as you do necessarily. Most of those companies are startups. Most of those companies are working with venture capital funds that they've got to repay. And it's safe to say that unless you're requiring of them sophisticated cybersecurity plans, sophisticated cybersecurity controls, audit protocols, those types of things, they may not have those kinds of things because those go to the bottom line. They're not generating revenue. So that's something to really take into consideration. It was also discouraging to find out that many organizations don't have cybersecurity professionals, not surprising, but that even those with cybersecurity professionals don't have consistent training or certifications. The industry doesn't have a standard certification. Excuse me. Pardon me. I apologize. And so we're hoping that as a result of this, that AASHTO and APTA will come up with kind of some standard training for the industry and some standard certification. Doing that will really be helpful. But one of the takeaways from this is that transit agencies should be training their entire staff, not just the technical staff, but their entire staff about how to protect the organization from cybersecurity attacks. Because they happen to everybody and they happen on a regular basis. Next slide, please. So one of the good news things that we learned is that agencies are reaching out for support. They're working with third-party vendors, and that's great, particularly when it comes to managing financial information, PCI-related information. If there's a takeaway from this presentation, it should be that you should not be managing your you should not be managing financial information if you can avoid it. PCI information, unless you are a big, sophisticated transit organization with the qualification to handle it, farm that stuff out and farm it out to somebody that is PCI compliant and make sure they're PCI compliant. But you should also, as you work with other third-party vendors, you should be forcing those vendors to be cybersecurity sophisticated and cybersecurity compliant, and impose upon them the requirements to be cybersecurity compliant that you may not be able to be. WMATA has a wonderful, is putting in place a great program for supply management in its supply management chain. There are programs that are coming into place, and in your contracts, you can put requirements that your contractors, your vendors, have cybersecurity programs in place to protect you and to protect your customers. And it'll take a while, but that's something you can do, and it's something you can do over time. Next slide, please. So we made a series of recommendations from the executive branch down to the agencies. At the executive branch, basically, the bottom line was that the Department of Homeland Security and the FTA should set basic standards for what should be expected of transit agencies, and that then they should require that the CEOs of those transit agencies attest that their agencies meet these basic requirements, and that the CEOs also should attest that they have outsourced the management of payment data to PCI compliant vendors, or that they are in fact PCI compliant themselves. Next slide, please. The last thing you want as a transit organization is yet another unfunded mandate. So our second recommendation goes to the legislature, and that's that the legislature should fund, if they're going to put in place these requirements, the legislature should fund these requirements. So the agencies should get the funding that's necessary to put these basic requirements in place, and the transit agencies themselves should get the funding that's necessary to meet these basic requirements. This is one of the I've been in Washington and in the government, in and around the government for over 30 years now. And this is one of the few places where the regulated industry wants requirements, wants to be told what to do. And so this was, I found, pretty interesting in that respect. Next slide, please. The associations, AASHTO and APTA, can do a lot here to help the agencies, particularly the small and mid-size. They can establish a clearinghouse for best practices, establish minimum guidelines for audits, establish a set of basic contract language that agencies can use, establish model language for those documents that I mentioned, and then, as I said, set up training modules and certifications. And again, having run a number of trade associations myself, I put this in there because I was always looking for non-dues revenue opportunities and added opportunities for my members. And so this is something that the trade associations can do, that their members need, and that they can add value. And then finally, next slide. So what can you do and what should you be doing now? The first and foremost thing you should do is you should do what I call is a risk assessment or a cybersecurity maturity assessment. You should find out where you stack up, where your vulnerabilities are. And that's not an expensive venture. There are firms, there are companies out there that can do this for you, help you with it. Again, it's not a pen test. It's looking at your entire organization. Do you have the documents in place? How are your contracts? Are you doing training? Do you have a cybersecurity model? Do you have a cybersecurity plan in place? All of those basic things. And then once you have that, then you can stack up the risks against all the other risks that you have and make the type of risk-based decisions and risk-based capital planning that you do in your normal the normal planning cycles that you do. But without that, you're flying blind. And then there are a series of other things that you can do that are listed here. Not all of it's, much of it is not that expensive, and much of it can be done very, very quickly, very easily. But you need to be aware of where you are, and recognizing that that many organizations are not sophisticated. They're small. They don't have the resources. And so figuring out kind of what your exposure is and what your risk is really the bottom line and the key here. And with that, I know people's time is short, so I'm going to stop. You can get a copy. Go back, please, where you were. You can get a copy of the slot of the full report at that website. It's also in the chat box, and I will answer any questions if anybody has any.
Do we have any questions from any attendees?
There are no questions in the chat. Charles, you had posted a question. Is that something you want to address yourself?
Just quickly, I was wondering if we as DOTs and on behalf of our subrecipients specifically are building in any kind of robust tools to address this kind of issue as we're moving more and more to these IT solutions. I mean, I know there's a lot of time and a lot of effort developing RFPs and going out through the whole process. Do we really pay enough attention? Are we paying enough attention to that element? Because I'm not sure it's always a large part of the package that's being sold to you. It's not being promoted that way, I don't think.
I agree with you, Charles. It's not, I mean, I have been, since this report's come out, I've probably given this presentation 25 times. I've given it to 7 state DOTs, and their transit their collection of transit organizations, which tend to be the small to mid-size. I am working with a small transit organization that will be a leader of APTA to try to put together some of the tools that we just talked about. I think it's really incumbent upon the trade associations or some coalition of either some of the states or some of the transit organizations to pool their resources and to put together some of the basic tools. Some of these basic tools can be put together relatively inexpensively, and that can benefit everybody. I mean, like I said, I think this screening tool for small to mid-size organizations is something that quite frankly, I'm in the process of plan to put together for another agency, and then we'll make available for agencies after that, and hope to have that available in the next few months for agencies. And I think many of the other things that are in this report can be put together in a similar fashion.
Okay, thank you, Scott. And Richard, I think that this is a topic that we can have more discussion on at an appropriate time during one of our MTAP conference calls. Going forward, we'll have more time to delve into the specifics. If you all will join me in thanking our participant, our panelists for today, Dr. Fitzpatrick, Victor, Dan, and Scott. I think we've got a wealth of information, some really good information that hopefully is going to shed some light on those critical issues that we're moving forward with. So without any further ado, I know we're pressed for time, Richard, so I'm going to move and turn this back over to you.
Well, right now it's supposed to be the discussion time. I don't see any comments or any questions in the chat. We are 4 minutes early. I'm happy to entertain any questions for any of our presenters. Going once, going twice. Sold. All right, ladies and gentlemen, that's a wrap for today. Please join us again today for session number 8 at 3 p.m. Discussion about state management reviews. Oh, it's going to get real. It's going to be a discussion. There are no presentations. It will be open for members to talk, but we will have FTA's Scott Gearing, whom we'd love to throw pins at every once in a while, and to help us talk about state management reviews. And we look forward to everyone being on with us at 3 p.m. Eastern for session number 8. Have a good break and see you in 30 minutes.